1945. Hanoi, a city that has just survived the Japanese occupation, suspended between anxiety and hope. A crowd gathers in the square. On a simple wooden platform stands a thin man in a plain gray suit. His face is calm, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the horizon. In his hands, a sheet of paper. And he begins to read words that, in that moment, sound almost impossible. Words borrowed from the American Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. His name is Ho Chi Minh. The crowd erupts. Women are crying. Men clench their fists. For a brief moment, it feels as if freedom has finally arrived. But reality is less romantic. Thousands of miles away in Europe, France, the old colonial power, is already discussing how to reassert control over Indochina. To French generals, Vietnamese independence is not a dream of a people. It is a threat to national prestige, and prestige must be defended. And somewhere in Washington, presidents and advisors examine the situation through a different lens: global strategy, ideological confrontation, the fear of losing face. They see numbers, they see maps, they see strategic positions. But they barely see the people standing in those streets with hope in their eyes. It seems unbelievable now, but this moment marks the beginning of a chain reaction, a chain of decisions, misjudgments, missed opportunities. Within 9 years, Hanoi and Saigon will become battlefields, and millions of lives will be pulled into a global struggle far larger than themselves. Today, decades later, we can trace every letter, every meeting, every order that followed. But on that humid August day in Southeast Asia, no one understood that the calm voice of a nationalist leader would echo into one of the most tragic wars of the 20th century. And this is where it begins. The war in Europe had ended. But for France, peace did not mean stability. The empire was cracking. In Paris, politicians spoke of prestige, of restoring national greatness, of reminding Europe that France was still a great power. Indochina, they believed, was the key. This was not just about territory, it was about reputation, national pride, the image of a nation that refused to fade. But Vietnam had changed. During the years of Japanese occupation, a force had grown stronger, one France had dangerously underestimated: the Viet Minh. This was not merely a guerrilla band hiding in the jungle. It was an organized movement, disciplined, patient, united by the idea of independence. Under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, they built supply lines, gathered intelligence, and prepared for a long war. And a long war is exactly what came. The First Indochina War began. For the French, it was far more complicated than expected. Their strategy relied on fortified positions, strongholds designed for European battlefields. But in the jungles and mountain valleys of Vietnam, fixed positions became targets. French generals depended on air power, on artillery, but their enemy was mobile, elusive, and supported by much of the local population. The financial burden was staggering. France was spending over $1.2 billion a year on the war, nearly half of its total military budget. By 1953, around 80% of those costs were effectively covered by the United States, quietly transforming Washington into the hidden sponsor of a colonial war. But officially, this was not about colonialism. It was about containing communism. The casualties mounted, year after year. French forces, more than 20,000 killed, over 60,000 wounded. Troops of the associated state of Vietnam, tens of thousands dead or missing. Viet Minh fighters, somewhere between 175 and 300,000 killed. Civilians, perhaps hundreds of thousands. The numbers are overwhelming. And yet, they still fail to capture the reality. Jungle warfare, no clear front line, artillery firing into vegetation, patrols moving through terrain where the enemy could be anywhere. In Paris, they debated budgets. In Hanoi, people were ready to fight to the end. This was never just about strategy. It was about will, identity, the right to claim a nation as your own. And here, quietly, the trajectory of future catastrophe was taking shape. A series of miscalculations, a steady underestimation of the opponent, and the rigid logic of Cold War politics binding France and the United States to a war that was becoming unwinnable. These years were not only military events, they were psychological warfare. And what began to erode first was French pride. Officers trained to command could not fully understand guerrilla tactics. Politicians far from the jungle did not see the cost until it appeared in casualty lists. By 1953, the strain was unmistakable. Garrisons weakened, resources depleted, strategy failing across multiple fronts. The war was no longer a campaign. It was becoming a nightmare. And then France made one final gamble. A remote valley in the northwest, a fortified base meant to draw the enemy in and crush him. Its name would soon become synonymous with defeat. Dien Bien Phu. The plan was ambitious, bold, and dangerously fragile. Spring 1954. Dien Bien Phu. A remote valley surrounded by jagged, jungle-covered mountains, isolated from the world. It becomes the center of the most decisive battle of the First Indochina War. General Henri Navarre, relying on his experience with European positional wars, builds the Hedgehog, a fortified base where French troops hope to draw the Viet Minh into open ground and destroy them with overwhelming fire. On paper, the plan is flawless. The French have aircraft, heavy artillery, professional troops, but in reality, the jungle, the mountains, and the extraordinary mobility of the guerrillas turn the plan into a trap. Colonel Charles Piroth, commanding the garrison's artillery, confidently declares, "I have more guns than I need. We will silence any enemy battery in minutes." He does not know that General Vo Nguyen Giap has already positioned 200 artillery pieces on the surrounding heights, hidden, camouflaged, invisible to French reconnaissance and air power. March 13, 1954. The bombardment begins. Viet Minh artillery tears through the silence, striking fortified positions, destroying barracks and supply depots. Inside the valley, panic spreads. Soldiers crouch in bunkers. They hear the whistle of shells. They feel the roar of explosions ripple through the earth. Piroth watches his promises collapse. He realizes artillery superiority is powerless against an enemy who has prepared every move, every hidden battery. The feeling of helplessness, of defeat, envelops him. On March 15th, he detonates a grenade in his own bunker. His death becomes a symbol of the tragedy of French strategy, arrogance and blind analysis leading to catastrophe. Dien Bien Phu is not only a story of losses and tactics, it is a psychological drama for both sides. France loses more than 2,293 soldiers. Nearly 11,000 are captured. Viet Minh loses over 23,000, but retains the strategic initiative. Surviving French prisoners return home years later, exhausted, broken. The fall of Dien Bien Phu triggers a chain reaction in Paris. The government of Joseph Laniel loses trust. Prime Minister Pierre Mendès France promises peace in Indochina within 30 days, or he will resign. For France, this marks the end of colonial rule in Southeast Asia. But on the northern side of the valley, Ho Chi Minh and his commanders know this is only the beginning. The victory strengthens Viet Minh morale and proves that determination and strategy can overcome technological superiority. In this valley, among mountains and jungle, a lesson is written. The West would not immediately learn. Victory in the jungle does not belong to the side with more guns, but to the side that understands the land, the people, and the spirit of a nation. Dien Bien Phu becomes the turning point, the event that sets the stage for the future division of Vietnam and the direct intervention of the United States. Every decision, every mistake, every loss. Another link in a chain that, July 1954, Geneva. Negotiations are underway. At long tables sit diplomats from the great powers: France, Britain, the Soviet Union, China. Formally, they discuss ending the war in Indochina. In reality, they are deciding the fate of a nation. France's defeat at Dien Bien Phu has marked the point of no return. Paris can no longer hold the colony. But Vietnamese independence does not arrive. Instead, a temporary compromise emerges, a solution meant to last just 2 years. The country is divided along the 17th parallel. The north falls under the control of the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh. The south remains under the formal head of state, former Emperor Bao Dai. He spends most of his time in France. He barely engages with real politics. The division is declared temporary. In 1956, nationwide elections are supposed to take place. The winner, whoever it is, will reunite Vietnam. On paper, it seems like a peaceful solution. But at the moment the agreements are signed, many already understand. These elections may never happen. The North begins building a new system: land reform, nationalization, strengthening the party's control. Harsh, sometimes bloody, but with a clear purpose: to create a state capable of withstanding outside pressure. The South, meanwhile, quickly becomes a field for external influence. In 1955, Bao Dai loses power. He is replaced by a man Washington sees as a reliable ally, Ngo Dinh Diem. Diem is a committed anti-communist, a Catholic in a mostly Buddhist country, a man of rigid views and strict methods. He is not a charismatic revolutionary. He is an administrator, an ideologue, a man who believes order is more important than popularity. The United States begins actively supporting his regime: money, advisors, military instructors. A new concept takes shape: a free South Vietnam as an alternative to Communist North. But there is a problem. If elections are held in 1956, who will win? Even American analysts privately admit Ho Chi Minh enjoys immense popularity across the country. By President Dwight Eisenhower's estimate, up to 80% of the population could vote for the northern leader. This is more than a number. It is a warning. For Washington in the 1950s, the world is divided into two camps. The Soviet Union expands its influence. China is already communist. The Korean War has just ended. In this atmosphere, a theory emerges, one that will shape U.S. strategy for decades: the domino theory. If one country falls to communism, the neighboring nations will inevitably follow. If a united Vietnam becomes communist, what next? Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Indonesia? Policy stops revolving around Vietnam as a country. It revolves around the fear of global defeat. The South Vietnamese leadership declares the Geneva Agreements legally non-binding. Formally, France signed them, not the new state of South Vietnam. Elections are postponed, then postponed again, then quietly removed from the agenda. In the North, this is seen as a betrayal of agreements. In the South, as protection of freedom. In Washington, a strategic necessity. For ordinary Vietnamese, it means one thing: the country remains divided. Hundreds of thousands move, from north to south, south to north. Families split apart, villages empty. The 17th parallel becomes more than a line on a map. It becomes a psychological wound. And the nature of the conflict begins to shift. While France was fighting, it was an anti-colonial war. Now it becomes an internal confrontation between two systems, a civil war with an international dimension. In the South, discontent with Diem grows: harsh repression of opposition, persecution of Buddhists, corruption among elites. A clandestine movement begins to form, later known as the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, or simply the Viet Cong. But in 1955 to 1956, it still seems manageable. America is not yet at war. The North is not yet invading. The South is officially building a state. Everything appears fragilely balanced. In truth, this is only a pause before the storm. The decision not to hold elections becomes the moment when political compromise gives way to future military confrontation. Vietnam's history turns again, quietly. No gunshots, no loud announcements, but in that silence, the foundation of the next war is being laid. History rarely unfolds on its own. Usually, it is shaped by people with fears, ambitions, convictions. Mid-20th century Vietnam was not just front lines and diplomatic papers. It was a clash of characters. In the north, a man who lived for one goal for decades, Ho Chi Minh. He was no typical revolutionary. He disliked showy luxury. He avoided the cult of personality common in Europe. Short, lean, in simple clothes, he projected the image of Uncle Ho, a modest father of the nation. But beneath that simplicity was a strategist. Few remember that in the 1910s and 1920s, he lived in France, in Britain, in the United States. He studied Western political systems, read the American Declaration of Independence, admired Woodrow Wilson's rhetoric on self-determination. In 1945, he deliberately quoted the American Declaration, hoping for support from Washington. He later sent letters to President Harry Truman trying to open a dialogue. He received no reply. To the American administration, he was slowly no longer a nationalist. He was a communist, part of a global bloc tied to Moscow and Beijing. For Ho Chi Minh, ideology and nationalism were intertwined. He knew, without support from the socialist camp, he could not defeat the colonial powers. But his ultimate goal remained constant, a united Vietnam. In the South, another type of leader emerges, Ngo Dinh Diem. Not charismatic in the usual sense, not charming, but firmly convinced of his mission. A Catholic in a Buddhist country, a nationalist, aligned with the United States, a man of discipline, of strict order. He truly believed that only a strong, centralized authority could stop communism. Diem begins campaigns against armed sects, criminal syndicates, regional warlords. He aims to build a state, not a coalition of factions, but his methods breed discontent. Repression, press control, privileges for Catholics, pressure on the Buddhist majority. Instead of uniting society, he deepens internal divisions. Washington long considers him the best option available. But over time, it becomes clear his regime is fragile. And then a third figure enters, a man who did not start the war, but would accelerate its escalation. John F. Kennedy, a young president, symbol of a new America, charismatic, intellectual, surrounded by analysts and advisors. By the time he takes office, there are already American military advisors in Vietnam, about 900. By the end of his presidency, their number grows to roughly 16,000. Formally, it is not a war. It is assistance, support, training the South Vietnamese army. But every new batch of advisors, every helicopter, every base, it pulls America deeper into the conflict. Kennedy fears a repeat of the loss of China, fears accusations of being soft on communism. He does not want a full-scale war, but cannot allow an ally to fail. Here, the trap takes shape. The North cannot abandon unification. The South cannot stabilize without external support. America cannot withdraw, fearing strategic consequences. Each leader acts rationally, within their own logic, yet their rational decisions combine into an irrational outcome. History increasingly resembles a mechanism of gears, turning independently, but inevitably leading to collision. By the early 1960s, the situation appears as tense. Vietnamese history is always shrouded in legends. Many of these legends repeat themselves over decades, sometimes shaping a distorted view of the war, even for those who think they know the story. Myth number 1. The United States came to protect democracy. Listen to this version, and it's easy to imagine American leaders as knights arriving to save a suffering people. But reality is far more complicated. The 1956 elections, promised by the Geneva Agreements, never happened. Ho Chi Minh, the candidate almost guaranteed to win, was denied his chance. South Vietnam and its American allies decided that a free alternative was the best way to protect democracy. In practice, it was a choice where the winner had already been determined, from outside. And so, the first myth is born. We came to save freedom. In reality, the freedom of the people was secondary. Policy was built on fear, on the Cold War, on calculations of potential losses and gains. Myth number 2. The war was purely an ideological battle, communism versus capitalism. At first glance, it seems true. The North, communist; the South, anti-communist; America, defender of capitalism. But dig deeper, and you see a civil war where the population is divided along social, religious, ethnic lines. Buddhists and Catholics, peasants and landowners, former collaborators and partisans. Everyone had their own motives. Ideology was a tool to mobilize the masses, but it did not explain all the actions of the sides. Myth number 3. The escalation happened by accident. Stories often suggest, oh, the torpedo boats attacked, the president signed a document, and everything just spun out of control. But in reality, every decision was a logical step in a sequence. From Ho Chi Minh's letters to Harry Truman, ignored by Washington, to Dien Bien Phu, which shattered French control. From the cancellation of the 1956 elections to Kennedy sending more advisors, it was a chain of causes and effects. There was no accidental involvement. There were choices made by people, their fears, their strategies. When we lift the veil of myths, the Vietnam War is not an epic clash of ideologies. It is the tragedy of a people drawn into the complex games of internal and external powers, a chain of carefully calculated steps that gradually turned a regional conflict into a global catastrophe. Examining these myths helps us understand why the war lasted so long, why it was so bloody, and why it remains so difficult for modern politicians and historians to fully comprehend. In the next block, we will look at the chronological unfolding of events. To see how each decision stacked on the next, how personal ambitions and mistakes intertwined with global politics, shaping the fate of an entire nation. August 1964. The waters of the Gulf of Tonkin. On the surface, an American destroyer, the USS Maddox, on a reconnaissance mission tracking the movements of North Vietnamese vessels. August 2nd. The first encounter. North Vietnamese torpedo boats close in on the Maddox. A brief skirmish, minimal damage, no casualties, but tension hangs in every radio transmission. 2 days later, August 4th. Reports arrive of a second attack. The Senate, the press, all of America, everyone believes our fleet is under threat. For many on the mainland, this feels like a signal, a call to action. But history, as it often does, is more complicated. Declassified NSA documents, analysis of President Lyndon Johnson's communications, later reveal that the second attack never happened. Radar glitches, engine noise, bad weather, all mistaken for torpedo strikes. Intelligence interpreted the data to match the existing fears of the administration. Even the sailors admitted, "We saw nothing. Nothing hit the ship. Everything seemed like a threat." But by then, the political machine was already in motion. President Johnson receives the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, a document granting virtually unlimited authority to wage war without a formal declaration. Decision made. America, formerly a distant observer, is now a full participant in the conflict. The irony. The nation enters one of the longest and costliest wars of the 20th century, not because of a sudden impulse, but because of a chain of decisions, fears, and misinterpretations. Each step seemed logical on its own. Vietnam's fate is no longer in Vietnamese hands. It passes into the control of a global superpower, one that does not yet understand what it is stepping into. This incident becomes the point of no return. The war ceases to be a potential threat. It becomes inevitable, full-scale, global in consequence. From this moment, there is no turning back. Every decision, every escalation, every strategy, all confirm that the path began in the shadows of misunderstanding, fear, and political pragmatism. America officially enters the war, and Vietnam is changed forever. The world will never be the same. By 1964, Vietnam would never be the same. France has finally left the region, leaving behind the ruins of a colonial empire and a lingering sense of lost influence. Years of struggle against the Viet Minh have drained Paris, leaving the country unprepared for new ambitions. The nation is divided along the 17th parallel. The North is under the control of the Viet Minh, an organization hardened by decades of fighting colonial power, ready for mass mobilization. The South exists on paper, but its government is unstable, teetering on the edge of internal crisis and external pressure. The 1956 elections, which could have united the country peacefully, never happen. Hope for a democratic solution collapses. The failure becomes a symbol. Foreign interests now outweigh the will of the Vietnamese people to decide their own fate. In the South, Ngo Dinh Diem attempts to impose order, crack down on armed sects and criminal syndicates, but faces constant resistance and growing instability. His government lives under the shadow of internal uprisings and relies heavily on external support. The United States, still formally not at war, is already deeply involved, politically, militarily, strategically. MAG advisors, then thousands of military instructors, equipment, money, all transforming the U.S. from observer into active participant. After the Gulf of Tonkin incident, Congress grants President Lyndon Johnson unlimited authority to conduct military operations. Formally, it provides maneuvering space, but in reality, it entangles the United States in a mechanism difficult to escape. These years set the foundational conditions that would define the entire Vietnam War. The conflict has not yet fully erupted, but the political and military machinery is already in motion, dragging all sides into its orbit. By 1964, it is clear. War is almost inevitable. The mechanism is set in motion. Any mistake, any new decision, could turn a local conflict into a global confrontation. These years are preparation, a strategic pause before the storm, a pause loaded with tension, fear, ambition, and misunderstanding. And it is this preparation that predestines the catastrophe which will unfold years later, when the first rounds of American artillery echo across Vietnamese soil. The war has not yet begun in full, but the consequences of decisions made between 1945 and 1964 already shape its form, its participants, and its cost. In the next segment, we will explore the reasons that made escalation inevitable and examine how the mistakes, fears, and ambitions of leaders led to a tragedy from which Vietnam and the United States could not escape without enormous loss. The history of Vietnam is not just a clash of ideologies. It is not simply communism versus capitalism. It is a tragedy woven from countless human decisions, fears, and mistakes. Letters ignored, letters that might have prevented escalation. Overestimated control, when great powers believed they could easily manage another country. Underestimated nationalism, a force that could not be broken by weapons or promises. The fear of losing face, turning isolated errors into a chain leading straight to catastrophe. Each decision on its own seemed logical, each action justified. But together, they created a situation from which there was no easy escape. And this is where the first chapter of our story ends. In the next episode, America will take a step that transforms a political crisis into a full-scale war. The North and the South will be drawn into conflict. Advisors will become soldiers. A local problem will become a global tragedy. This is the story of how politicians, generals, and national leaders, acting rationally, set in motion a chain of events that would lead to disaster. In the next episode, we will see how this mechanism starts running at full speed. The story of Vietnam continues, and its lessons, urgent and painful, are waiting for us to understand.